pleasure to have you here with us today to discuss the concepts of proactivity and innovation. I hope it will be a good chat. Sometimes people say, wouldn't it be more interesting for a business administrator or a speaker focused on these institutional, corporate topics to address this? And the more I delve into our approach to these topics, the more I'm convinced that it's not. That this is a very good topic for philosophy, and that it should be the first to be called upon to give its opinion. Do you know why? Philosophy has the habit of circling around a concept and see if it is universally valid. If it holds true for society as a whole, if it holds true for the institution, if it holds true for the individual, it's the idea of time management and concentric circles. Therefore, when I teach time management, I usually tell people, if you want to plan your life effectively, first, you start by planning life as a whole. Then, frame the decade, the year, the month, today's day. That's how it is when we want to test a new value, a new concept, to place it in the life of the human being as a whole and then gradually narrow the stage. To perceive all the edges, all the elements that need to be clarified, upon which we need to shed light, so that the concept is well assimilated and, therefore, practicable. So, I hope that our conversation is particularly valuable when it comes to, for example, proactivity, which isn't such an old concept. So much so that, sometimes, people confuse it with productivity. And they are quite different things. Well, we notice in the institutional field, as well as in the private business sector, a great interest today in the process of humanization in adding values. But many times, this process is not carried out considering all the human aspects of the matter, which, for a philosopher, is the first thing we need to address, because the fundamental thing is that the whole process moves in the direction of a humanization. So we'll see, and I view this very positively, companies integrating this into their processes. A department, a group, a compliance advisory team that monitors the implementation of codes of ethics. Or a study of the so-called soft skills, which are virtues applied to the workplace. Great, very interesting. But when do we not remember that the humanist objective must be above all else? Often, these objectives can end up unsuccessful. For example, I've given some lectures and done some work with companies in this area of compliance. However, if you consider that a company is concerned with the code of ethics just because the anti-corruption law has just come out, that process is probably not going to work. Why? Because the employee, the staff number involved in this, will feel manipulated. They will realize that it's not ethics itself that matters, but a certain social coercion. The same thing applies to virtues. If an employee of any enterprise realizes that the company wants them to be virtuous because they are more sociable, have better interpersonal skills, are more productive, and provide a greater financial return, they will probably think the opposite. Well, then they're not thinking about me, they're thinking about productivity. And the opposite case is if tomorrow or the day after a new theory comes along that says I produce more quickly without virtues, the strategy changes. The strategy changes because it's not my fulfillment that's at stake, but rather a material outcome. In other words, the outcome of the process is things, not people. And this is an element I've seen that undermines many initiatives, some very well-intentioned. Therefore, the focus that philosophy provides above all else is humanism. Well, Kant, who is a philosopher of fundamental importance, an Enlightenment philosopher, said that a rational being, that is, a human being, can never be a means to any process. He can never be used for something that is not his own well-being. The human being, the rational being, must always be the end of every process. In other words, any transformation within the body of an institution that does not have human well-being as its end, but merely as a means, will end up, in some shape or form, being frustrated in its aims. It will end up discredited because, deep down, it generates resistance, even if people don't quite know why. Therefore, each concept we are applying must be well understood from a humanistic perspective. I often mention in some of our talks here, I've talked about this before. Also, that any process within an institution of any kind must rely on three types of authority. The one who leads must have intellectual authority, know the process, must have moral authority, work alongside others, and must have human authority. Which means considering that a job well done is not just when things end up well done, but when things end up well done and people end up well too. Preferably, it should provide opportunities for people to grow during the process. That would be ideal because then you truly bring values to the world. It generates products that are also necessary. It generates services that are also necessary, but it also generates human beings who are engaging, growing, and contributing their best to the process. And proactivity. We'll see that it is a value closely related to this. It has everything to do with this. So, what does it mean to be a proactive person? It's someone who, as they say, does more than what is expected of them in any situation. Therefore, a person who receives a request from a leader, from a boss, who fills everything there on time and in the best possible way, is a productive person. What is expected of a proactive person? That they think not only about what was asked of them, but also about ways to improve the process, to envision more efficient processes, to take the initiative to fully commit to that institution and work with imagination, creativity, and innovation to make the process more effective. In other words, he feels like he owns that institution, that enterprise. Therefore, he puts all his enthusiasm into perfecting it, and not just their effort in fulfilling. And this is quite a complex concept, and difficult to achieve. Do you know why? Because it is a systemic concept. It doesn't depend solely on one part of an institution. It depends on this institution being organic. Everyone should be involved in this pursuit, in this concept, and the exchange of information should be very lively. Inside there. So, we'll talk and think a little about this concept of proactivity. He talks about someone who is proactive, who foresees the future, anticipates difficulties, is capable of overcoming them before they happen, and takes responsibility. I found this idea of taking responsibility quite interesting. In other words, taking the reins of what you're doing and taking responsibility for making it better. Owning what you do. This is quite interesting because there is a philosophy that is nearly 2,000 years old, about 1900 years, which is Stoicism. And one of the things that Roman Stoicism emphasized the most was that the extinction of blame marks the beginning of moral progress. In other words, when we stop shifting blame, when we take the reins of our lives and take responsibility for what happens to us, for what we do, we halt a highly detrimental process, which is victimization. In other words, everything that happens was against me, everything that happens. I was a victim. I'm responsible for nothing that happens in my life. Obviously, this process of constantly positioning oneself as a victim of external forces undermines our energy. And it causes people to keep shifting responsibility onto others, and no one takes responsibility for anything. Therefore, a proactive person is someone who holds the reins of their life and work in their hands. She takes responsibility for what she does, and is bold and wants to go further. She is willing to take risks, wants to go beyond. I find this quite interesting. But there are some developments that we necessarily have to think about. Today, it is said in specialized literature that HR departments, human resources, and private companies already have specific tests to select people with this profile. That they are highly valued in the job market. Okay, But how can this really be encouraged in people? How does it work? If you consider that a proactive person has the ability to participate in processes, solve challenges, and avoid problems, and sometimes even learn other skills than their own to see the problem within a broader field, we realize that there are a series of intertwined things. For example, if she wants to see the process as a whole, that information needs to be accessible to her. She cannot be considered like Chaplin, remember that movie in modern times? Like a screw tightener in one of the stages of the process, who does not even know which one he's tightening. It's the machine in which piece you tighten the screw. You are responsible for a small slice. Look closely. Proactivity is directly linked to motivation. And by seeing just a tiny piece of the process, no one gets motivated. Therefore, we'll see that the conditions, the characteristics of this value, this virtue, have a prerequisite. The first of the three requisites, that all the information about the process is accessible to you. Moreover, if you're going to wear the company's jersey, first and foremost, you need to see that jersey in its entirety, examine all its features, and also have the freedom to even make suggestions about the jersey you are going to wear. Therefore, it requires a flow of information. It requires that an institution be like an organic whole, where information flows in all directions. We live in a time where the movie Modern Times summed up well what was happening, a somewhat grim and belated legacy of the Industrial Revolution, where each person mastered a piece of the process. And only the leader would think. Only he thought about how to improve the process. Only he was given the right to innovate. He was the thinker, and the others were mere executors. We are trying to change that. Proactivity is precisely a demand for change. It has already been realized that this does not work. Now, look, if we'll see that everyone should be thinkers and doers, it's evident that this leader, who initially had this role all to himself, must be an inspirer of this. He also has to be a proactive being, so that any demand you have for him, he knows the process well where his department, his team is involved. He doesn't just know that little piece where the screw is cracked. He has a complete vision. Remember the ISO 9000 maxim? Think globally, act locally. In other words, leaders also need to strive to be the most proactive of all. Because it's through these department heads, these sector leaders, that proactivity can flow to all employees. So, these leaders are a key piece. They have to be proactive. Otherwise, they close the door. All those led by him should have access to what is necessary to inspire someone with the process. There is no proactivity without motivation. I'm at least minimally motivated by what this company or institution does. Why would I wear a shirt when I don't even know what it represents? I don't know what it means to wear this shirt because I'll commit to this. Where will I find the motivation for it? Therefore, there needs to be transparency and a flow of information that clearly moves through these leaders, who must be the first to be very proactive. This is an obvious necessity. Another interesting thing we can stop to think about is the life of a human being as a whole. Perhaps you might not notice that the idea of proactivity originated around the World War II, but of course it has become more popular in recent times. Notwithstanding, around World War II, there was a psychologist, a thinker named Viktor Frankl, who was in concentration camps and lost his entire family, wife, father, mother, siblings, his whole family in Nazi concentration camps. And he advocated a theory, which later became the basis of a therapy called logotherapy, that the human being, with what he possesses in life, with what remains after all adversity, he can combine the factors to, from there, become a useful and fulfilled man. In other words, the original idea of proactivity went beyond just the work environment. It encompassed all of life. Today, we sum this up in a work environment and adopt a dual approach. Being reactive, meaning they send, I respond, or being proactive. Before anyone fails, or even before someone notices the need for action, I take the initiative. That's very good. But that's just the tip of the iceberg. That original idea from Viktor Frankl is still extremely necessary. What I'm trying to say with all this? Something basically simple. A human being who, in their personal life, isn't even slightly interested in what happens to their neighbor, doesn't wear the shirt of humanity, isn't very concerned with what happens to the whole. When adversity arises, he simply shuts himself inside his house and believes it will be an island of prosperity in a sea of chaos, without any commitment to his family, his community, his country, or humanity as a whole. He doesn't have the psychological habit of seeing a process as a whole. Why would he be like that as soon as he walked out the door of his workplace? Notice the biblical phrase, "You cannot serve two masters at the same time." Here I'm reactive, there I'm proactive. Will it work? In other words, proactivity is a process that works towards the transformation of the human being, in the sense that he assumes his responsibility within the whole. And this cannot have exceptions in your life. I often say that there are some virtues nowadays that are fenced-in virtues. What is a fenced-in virtue? You create a boundary from the fence inward. Outside, you don't do anything anymore. This exists, for example, in relation to education. Inside my house, I'll with my children, but once I step beyond the fence of my home, I'm no longer an educator to anyone. I no longer worry about setting a good example, about teaching, about passing on what I have that's best. It's no longer my problem. In other words, going back to the biblical phrase, you cannot serve two masters at the same time, you probably won't serve either of the two masters. There is something in the human psyche that longs for unveiling, for integrity, for coherence. Therefore, the creation of a proactive person, which is something highly desirable, would require a holistic mindset, a more fraternal mindset, a more global mindset, a real commitment to humanity. Today we are experiencing a process which we all know is difficult, a public health issue, but which will later turn into, and is already turning into, an economic problem, a social problem, perhaps even a political problem as well. And we all know that we'll only get through this together. Therefore, life too, as well, history is urging us to be proactive. The level of selfishness that our society practices, where everyone thinks only of their own interests, is the most anti-proactive process that can exist. Moreover, we are living in a historical moment with a pathology, with a disease that, unfortunately, has not yet found a solution, which is cancer. And what is cancer? Cancer is a cell that, within an organism, doesn't think about the body as a whole. It thinks only of itself and begins to exhibit abnormal behavior. And soon it gathers followers, multiplies, and continues with this abnormal behavior. That thinks only of itself, condemning the entire body, which ends up condemning itself. In other words, ultimately, we know that selfishness is suicidal. But we don't make the connection between what happens on the micro level within human bodies and what happens on the macro level within society. Therefore, proactivity is not a simple virtue. You can't have proactivity in a fenced-off way. Within my company, I wear the jersey of the whole and I think as a whole. Beyond my doorstep, I'm not concerned about humanity. I only care about what concerns my own skin and nothing else. This is definitely not going to work. We'll realize that true human values are universal. They are so deeply rooted within human consciousness that wherever this human being is, they radiate this value. Or else it's not real. It's a mask. So proactivity will have to generate a different mindset throughout a person's life. I recall a poem by Carlos Drummond de Andrade where he said, "We live in a time of parties, a time of divided men." So you realize that what happens outside, within society, is a reflection of the process that happens within us. Resolving this process is a gradual thing. It doesn't happen overnight. Proactivity is an invitation to directly confront selfishness, to be interested only in what concerns one's own skin, and extend this notion of identity. Plato, in a book I really like, which is a dialogue called The Republic, he says that within his ideal city, a certain class of men, who were the guardians, he would do something that you might find quite strange. All the children of the guardians who were born at the time of birth, they would shuffle them in a way, so that if 10 couples had children, those 10 children, no one would know exactly which one is theirs, and they would be obliged to take those 10 children as their own. That those 10 children would have 10 fathers, 10 mothers, and more grandparents, and more uncles, and more siblings, in such a way that, after a few generations, everyone within this class would be related to everyone else. What was his purpose? First of all, he said, a guardian will have to face a battle, and he fights with much more value when he has a brother by his side, rather than a stranger. But, secondly, and no less important, Plato believed that humanity is a family. That certain behaviors of ours make us lose this notion. We think that, for example, children, our offspring, are those who came from our physical bodies. Not the children of humanity are not our children. And he says this is an illusion. And some strategies at times would serve to break this illusion, and for man to realize the reality that humanity is his family. The children of humanity are his children. So he used a device. Notice that proactivity is another device, so to speak. It's a technique to achieve the same result, teaching the human being to think as a whole. And it is an extremely necessary process within our historical moment, not just for an institution, but for humanity. Therefore, it is delicate, yes, I reiterate. It demands a very intense qualitative change in human consciousness. And, at the same time, an adaptation of an institution. That, from the moment I put on the shirt of this institution, its improvement becomes a concern. Mine. The fact that it performs its function better is my concern. Therefore, my reflection, my motivation is dedicated to finding solutions, ensuring that my voice must necessarily be considered as soon as possible. Even if what I say isn't necessarily applied, it may or may not be, but my perspective must be taken into account. This is another issue related to proactivity. Today, we live in a world, whether in institutions or companies in general. A mindset that changes in the process must come from outside, from minds within an academic environment thinking about the process, and not within the environment of the institution where people are experiencing the process. That proactivity would also require this paradigm to be broken, and that the people who are living the process also have their perspectives considered. And not just those who are theorizing outside the experience of the process, away from the front lines of the process. Also, I repeat to you, proactivity requires a highly organic environment. A change is required at all levels of an institution. And a change as well, which is becoming very relevant today. Today, unlike before, people consider, for example, in a woman's childbirth process, the opinion of the grandmother, the presence of the doula. They consider that not only the person who studied and even participates in a process, but in a somewhat more distant way, not just the intellectual, but also the person who is intimately connected to the situation through an emotional bond, through life experience, is also worthy of being heard. In other words, today, life experience is also taken into account. In fact, this has led to a shift in the job market. in such a way that people who experience the process and have great maturity in it are now listened to as much as those who intellectualize the processes. And that is proactivity. This is also a requirement. Notice that it is a very demanding virtue. If we meet all that it demands, it would be a revolution that would elevate the quality of life, because when an institution becomes organic, it mirrors life. And there is no formula more effective than the formula of life to generate the new, to create that which brings beings closer to their fulfillment. And no one knows this as well as life does. Also to bring institutions closer to their fulfillment as such. Why not? Well, within a business structure, this is even more complicated. In fact, for example, I would say that both have a level of complexity because if I'm called to participate in a private company to be proactive, to fully connect to this institution, I necessarily have to know what this company is aiming for. To bring to the market, in product, in service, and not just know, but to get involved with it in some way. In other words, to see it as something useful, as something necessary. Therefore, it gives companies a need to provide ethical accountability to their employees, to those who participate in the process. You might say, well, we pay better. We'll even talk about that. I don't consider, and in fact, more and more in today's world, we see this, that the best form of motivation is just remuneration. The best form of motivation is to make people believe in a process and want to leave, their personal mark within it. Look, I added this. This process was more feasible, therefore it yields more results because it has my mark on it. I contributed in some way. As Khalil Gibran says, I'm a station for enriching the gifts of life. This process went through me and it moved faster when it passed through me because I was proactive. And you take pride in the product that was well made in the end. If you have some involvement, you believe in it. Therefore, within private companies, it involves each employee believing in the purpose of the process, in the product that is generated, in the service that is provided. And in public institutions, it's not so different either. Believe in the institution, understand well what it serves. I would go even further back in this process. I have lived for 31 years as a philosophy teacher, and I can assure you, we are living in a historical moment where the obvious no longer exists. Nothing we think is obvious is really that obvious. When you start defining very simple things, you realize that people no longer remember them, they no longer know what it's about. A public institution is a slice, a part of a public space, which is what we call the state. And it should be the first to be understood. All public servants should have a good understanding of what the state is, at least at a basic level. Therefore, if we were to consider, for example, a Platonic vision, Plato said that if every human being had the ability, when making a decision, to not only think of themselves, but to think of the good of the entire community, perhaps even all of humanity, that society would be self-governing by its participants and would not require a state. However, man does not have this capability, never did, and still doesn't. Thinks in a very selfish way when acting, when making decisions. Therefore, humanity cannot be orphaned, society, the collective cannot be orphaned. There must be someone whose purpose, whose role, is to think about humanity as a whole, to think about the community as a whole. And thus the state is born to provide the service, to meet the needs of the whole. And within this space, which is an institution created to meet collective needs, what part of these collective needs does my institution fulfill? In the case of labor justice, justice in labor relations, where the worker is respected and valued. In what it does, a relationship where there is no abuse of power, no pressure, nor any kind of misconduct from either side within one of the professions. One of the most important sectors of society is the creative profession, the work, the labor craft. Well, I understood the meaning of what I do. Let me see how this is being done. Oh no, that's just for people who are specialists in the legal aspect of labor justice. No, it's for anyone who participates in it. Let me understand, at least basically, how this works. Let me understand, because by understanding, I can dare to imagine. Is this really the best way? Could there be some small detail that could be implemented? How I'll wear a shirt, I reiterate, if they don't allow me to look at the shirt. How I'll wear something if I can't stand in front of the mirror because I can't see it. So, it's necessary to understand the process as a whole. Notice that it becomes more complicated, increasingly complicated, requiring a change in the mindset of the institution as a whole. I have to see and I have to have the freedom to think. And what if it weren't like this? Could there be other ways where small details could improve the flow of the process? Can't I rethink the process? That's what is asked of a proactive person. And there's no point in beginning. No, we'll think about everything. Let's just think about our department. You're going back to the modern times of Chaplin. Let's just think about this piece where you're going to put the screw. No one gets motivated. No one is proactive by just looking at that little piece of a mechanism without knowing what the whole mechanism is. So, it's a demanding virtue. But very good. Because it moves towards humanization, not just of the part, the server, the employee, but also of the whole, the institution. It makes the whole a much more vital body, with a flow of information, with the participation of all its cells towards a common goal. In other words, a healthier body, closer to the process of life. But it's definitely not simple. There is a strong connection between motivation and the ability to put a bit of ourselves into what we do. There is a very strong relationship between knowing the end of the process, loving the end of the process, in other words, my capacity for imagination. To innovate, for example, if I paint, I know what a painting is. I know what it's for, I know its purpose, what it can generate for people. And also by knowing the end of the process, I am motivated to improve the means. I am motivated to improve my technique, to use more suitable materials, to use a more appropriate base. In other words, understanding the process brings me motivation and enables proactivity. Those who aim for the ends aim for the means, and that's classic. As an investor, and this is interesting, we should also consider this aspect. If you're going to buy shares in a company, it's clear that a shareholder, especially one intending to purchase a significant amount of shares, has the right to demand that the enterprise explains everything to them. Where is he investing his money? For what purpose? What is the strategy of this company to ensure that this money is well invested and yields returns? That's fundamental in the market. Well, the proactive person is the one who is investing their life in an institution. Therefore, he needs to understand it very well. It's a very high investment. So, this is a small process, a little touch of provocation. Proactivity is a complex value, and applying it can be a qualitative leap. But it requires that all its philosophical ramifications be considered. Sometimes I get a little startled and I share this with you. Because, like the process, like a whole, done the right way, in the way we seem, considered philosophically, it seems too big and too laborious. Sometimes within the business market, for example, the temptation of shortcuts arises, and some shortcuts are complex. I can't speak much about this because it's not my specialty. It's completely out of my scope. But what I've read, what I've investigated, I confess it scares me a little. Business strategies of the type of gamification. Of course, I might have received some incorrect information, but within the specific institution that deals with this, the information I received was the following. Do you know what gamification is? It was copied from the game mechanism, that is, from a children's game. A bunch of elements are created. I'll even read it to you because I found it so curious that only by reading can we understand it better. Missions that alternate throughout the week to maintain the element of surprise during the entire period. In other words, missions are sent to a work team through their cell phones. They go about trying to solve these missions. Highly competitive, meaning it generates competition among the people in that team. The players, they play, that's what they call it. The players play individually on their phones, but they compete in groups. And the victories are rewarded. Look, this idea, if we were to consider it. When you resort to a flaw to achieve a virtue, you're being Machiavellian and it probably won't work out. That the ends do not justify the means. Ends and means must be consistent. Therefore, getting a group of adults addicted to a game, it's not good for children, let alone for adults. And encouraging competition at a time when it's meant for cooperation. It's for us to stop thinking about winning over others. It's about learning to win together. And still encouraging, with this type of gratification, of constant bonuses. Honestly, this kind of reminds me of a treat. Have you ever seen how dog training is done? Did something right, give a treat. This works a lot with animal awareness. Therefore, we have to be careful because sometimes the intention is good, but the means are questionable. To make proactivity work, you have to follow the right means, and that is humanization. Curiously, my daughter works with this. And she would tell me, Mom, training today, in some countries abroad, isn't like that anymore. It's no longer about hitting or stimulating and giving treats. They start working like the animal's intelligence. Make the animal, which has an emotional bond with its owner, realize that the defense it will perform protects and benefits its owner. Make it so that, by relating these two things, it acts out of love. Imagine yourselves. Even animals with a bit more development no longer work with this type of training. Therefore, as the Romans used to say, easy paths deceive. This type of strategy, we must be careful with it. Proactivity is excellent, but we need to know what the solid paths are for Gaius Laelius through the front door, down the main road, and not through any detours, which sometimes might mean that gamification isn't just that. But I'm telling you, based on the explanation I received. Because I went there, I sought it out, to want to understand and complement my view on this subject. Now, speaking a bit about the issue of innovation. Innovation has an important characteristic. It is encompassed within proactivity, but innovation is not the same as renewal. They are different. Renewal is simply giving a better facade to everything you already had. Innovation changes the essence of a process, and the focus of that process seeks what can truly be added to that process. To gain a step in quality, in refinement, so that the process truly leads a step towards the future. Don't just be a rearranged repetition of what happened in the past. If you notice, for example, the advancement of science, if you take Albert Einstein's thinking, it's not simply a reorganization of Newton's thinking. Within it, there are absolutely new ideas. That is innovation. Newton's thinking, in turn, is not simply a rearrangement of Kepler's thinking. It has nothing to do with it. There are completely new things there. In other words, everything that progresses by capturing new things. And it advances in the right direction. And it's important to understand this. Every productive, necessary, and positive process within an institution works and moves towards humanization. Therefore, for a person to grasp something new that improves a work process or elevates an institution to greater effectiveness, they must have access to this new. And, classically, how is it said that man gains access to the new? Plato used to say that there is a realm of ideas at a certain level of nature where all the necessary ideas in the universe reside. Man, in truth, does not create, he captures. And how does he capture new ideas? Not applied here. When he has the moral stature for his head to touch the realm of ideas and his feet to touch the ground. In other words, he builds a bridge between two realms. I don't know if you understand what I mean by this. A level of generosity, of altruism, a level of absence of prejudices, of personal blockages, which allows a person to truly see something new. There is nothing that purifies a human being more than a moral life, than the practice of good, because it clears this channel. Taoism spoke so much about this channel. The channel, which is the human being, is what we must try to keep unobstructed, so that these ideas can flow through it and reach the world. The man becomes a bridge builder. Therefore, to innovate, see how curious this is, to truly be innovators and not merely those who give a makeover to what already existed, mere renovators, we also have to grow as human beings. Moreover, we also need to strive for a proper moral life, ensuring that ideas don't get stuck along the way, caught on the hooks of our selfishness, in our mere pursuit of personal interests. So, the entire process, the innovation of identifying points where the process gets stuck, seeing points that are already obsolete, and figuring out how to make things more fluid, requires that within you, ideas are also fluid, not blocked by these obstacles. The Taoist tradition says that shadows were born in the world because man became opaque, meaning light enters a person as if they were a bamboo pipe. If there are obstructions inside, the light doesn't get through. On the other side, the shadow arrives. Shadows are born in the world because man has become obstructed, opaque. Then, due to competitive interests, petty interests, the desire to be above everyone else, and the inability to think holistically. So, innovation also requires a well-functioning good channel. This channel is the very nature of humanity, the very character of a person. Therefore, realize that everything is very intertwined, and that's exactly how it should be. Any valid process, I reiterate, makes human beings grow. Otherwise, it is debatable. To be proactive, we must grow, we must combat selfishness. To have innovation, we must grow, we must align with the order of the universe, have trust in the laws of life, and also engage in a process of combating selfishness, fostering greater altruism. To desire that goodness flows through you to benefit not just yourself. But overall, both virtues demand this. So, reiterating what we were discussing as a conclusion to these ideas of ours, and I hope it provides you all with good reflections. And any change in the process that you initiate should lead to a better humanity, to better men and women, because otherwise it's complicated. You're using people as a means. We know, according to Kant, that this is something immoral. And that way, we don't get very far. Any virtue must involve life as a whole of a human being, not just one part of it. Growing is always humanizing. There's no way you can get lost on the path. If lost, look, what is the direction of becoming more human? That which makes a human being more worthy of the human condition, with virtuous values, wisdom, a little closer to them at least. Growth is in that direction. Easy paths deceive, as the Romans used to say, in aspera veritas, in difficulty lies the truth. Therefore, think. It is more than necessary to work with proactivity and innovation, but consider all the necessary requirements. Not just think, but be willing to pay the price for it to happen, because this is a call to action. Not just an institution needs this, humanity needs this. And I hope we are truly willing to pay this price. For us, for those we love, for all those around us. It is a historical necessity. Thank you very much, and may you have insightful reflections.